done. Really, a lot done. In fact, UK, we signed a...
You can't handle the truth.
Resolve to resist.
Yes. Winks there. I know I missed the first two. You gotta look fast. So what is Mark Carney winking about? Well, we'll be back in mere moments. And this is David Krayden broadcasting live from Ottawa. Thanks for joining Stand on Guard. When we come back, I'll tell you what the show is all about today.
The Prime Minister lied and his minions continue to lie.
We need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist.
Yes, thank you for subscribing or resubscribing if you have to do that. Sometimes people get unsubscribed. But share this broadcast, please, with your friends and family so we can expand the audience. Always have to fight for that every day. Thank you for watching today. Jeff Rath, the legal counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project, will be joining me this morning. And this is their big day. They're releasing the report, the value of freedom. And actually, we've got a scoop on this. We're about 2 hours ahead of them. They're having a news conference today, 10 o'clock Alberta time, Mountain time. So here we are, 10 o'clock Eastern time with the goods and with an interview with Jeff Rath. So I'm sure you're all looking forward to that. Before we get to Jeff, though, I want to say Mark Carney has got a winking problem. It's a National Post story that came out on July 2nd, which is yesterday. And winking can be a very innocuous expression of your feelings, or it can be a very arrogant expression of your feelings. With Mark Carney, everything is arrogant. Everything is superiority, or I would say insouciance, the way Justin Trudeau embodied insouciance. Like, I don't care. Hey, I'm in control here. I am the center of attention, so I can wink. But you wink behind Donald Trump's back, and baby, you're in trouble, because Donald Trump notices. Yeah, he watches the news. He watches the video clips. He knows Mark Carney's winking behind his back, just like he knew Justin Trudeau was winking behind his back. But, we've got to take credit for this, folks, that we are the ones who identified the winking problem from the book of Proverbs. And one of our viewers pointed this out. The man of integrity walks securely, but he who takes crooked paths will be found out. He who winks maliciously causes grief, and a chattering fool comes to ruin. Well, Mark Carney comes off as a chattering fool at times, doesn't he? With all of the ums and the ohs and the uhs. And he actually, many times, says absolutely nothing. When we come back, though, we're going to discuss, or when we come back after the interview with Jeff, we're going to discuss, actually, why Mark Carney should not be winking, not only behind the back of Donald Trump, but behind the backs of Canadians who increasingly are being impoverished by Mark Carney, who are increasingly suffering bankruptcies under Mark Carney, who are increasingly headed down a path of authoritarianism and lack of free speech under Mark Carney. That's where we're headed. And that's nothing to wink about. Although Mark Carney thinks we're all in on the joke. But he knows he's putting one over on us. He's playing us. We're being played, folks. This happens all the time with people like Mark Carney. So without further ado, though, I want to get to the interview with my good friend, and he really has become a good friend over the last couple of months, Jeff Rath, legal counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project, and one of the authors of the value of freedom. And as I said, we're about 2 hours ahead of the official news conference. This will be on the Alberta Prosperity Program website by noon Eastern Time, 10 Mountain Time. So I want to get onto this interview because I really enjoy doing this. One, thank you for joining me this morning and Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden. I'm with Jeff Rath, who, of course, you've met before. He's been on the show twice to talk about Alberta independence. He's the legal counsel for the Alberta Prosperity Project. And before we get into the report, I just want to show it to you. I just read this entirely this morning. 44 pages, The Value of Freedom. I think it has an excellent title, by the way, Jeff. Fantastic title.
That was my major contribution to the project.
Yeah, it's great. It really, really says it all. And as I was saying before we actually went on the air, I don't think Quebec could put together a document like this because Quebec is a taker. It doesn't give to the country. It takes a lot. And it doesn't have an economic basis for separation. It's all about feelings. It's all about this great patriotism for the fleur-de-lis and the flag and their hatred of Canada and their hatred of Canadian institutions. But there's no fiscal reality to Quebec independence. There never has been. And they've always wanted their cake and eat it too. That's why if you go back to René Lévesque, it was sovereignty association because they wanted independence, but they wanted the benefits of Canada because they can't stand up on their own 2 feet. They never have been able to. But I don't want this to be an episode of Quebec bashing because what you've done here, and that's really what I wanted to say. You've established the fiscal reality for an independent Alberta. You've established why this would be a financial windfall for the citizens of Alberta and just how badly this province is being tossed around, shall we say, by the federal government without any idea about why the people are so upset that independence has now become, I would say, on the road at least to inevitability. But if we look at this introduction, I think it's, and I've got to put my glasses on to read it, but the intention of this document is to provide clarity on the finances and key elements of an independent Alberta compared to Alberta as a province in the Canadian Dominion. It seeks to answer the question, what is the tangible value of independence for Albertans? Now, we'll get back to that. But, Jeff, I think you've answered that question in this document. And I think this is something you can be proud of. And I hope you can get this document far and wide across the province. And so people can actually read what their options are.
Well, we're very proud of the document. We're very excited about it. I mean, for a lot of us, when you go to the executive summary in the document, it makes it clear that immediately upon independence, that Alberta is going to have a fiscal capacity surplus of between, and I'm just going to round the numbers up, between $30 and $48 billion a year. So that's after paying, tripling the spend on Indigenous people to lift them out of the abject poverty that Canada's left them in, costing an Alberta reserve or our armed forces at 3% of GDP, costing external affairs, immigration and deportation, border control, airports, all of those things that Canada provides, costing everything that Canada provides, keeping our same level of healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. We end up with this massive fiscal capacity surplus, which could either be applied to paying our teachers more, paying our nurses more, paying our, building more hospitals, whatever it is. All that money stays in Alberta. Even the Indigenous spend, if you think about it, you put an extra several $1 billion into Indigenous communities in Alberta to help lift them out of poverty. Where does that money get spent? It gets spent in Alberta, not Quebec, which is the current regime. So think of the massive economic growth and the economic spin-offs in Alberta through the massive economic stimulus that's going to be created by all of Alberta's wealth staying in Alberta and being spent in Alberta instead of being wasted on electric choo-choo trains from Toronto to Montreal like Justin Trudeau wanted to do. I think he wanted to take $40 billion of Alberta's money and build an electric choo-choo train. I guess Carney's a step better. He wants to take $50 billion of our money and build a giant carbon sucking machine. At least he wants to build it in Alberta. But make no mistake, it's a complete waste of our money. Building something that's completely unnecessary simply because you have a bunch of Brookfield adjacent engineering firms and construction companies and engineering companies that are lining up at the trough with their knives and forks, waiting to get their face into the trough and suck up $50 billion worth of Albertans' money in some stupid carbon scheme. So, obviously from our perspective, the what we say is the value of freedom, is priceless. I mean, no more, money being wasted. Everything in Alberta is fully costed and paid for, and we have a massive fiscal surplus that can be applied to tax cuts. So, and then, Danielle Smith has been running around saying, I'm going to get another pipeline. I'm going to get another pipeline. I'm on Team Canada, rah, rah, right? And, but think about that. So for every new pipeline we get, Danielle Smith says we're going to get another $20 billion a year in revenue. Under her model, 10 billion of it goes to the federal government. So she's all excited about the fact that she gets to send another $10 billion a pipeline to Quebec and the rest of Canada. We say all that money stays here. So if we get another $20 billion staying in Alberta from the Keystone pipeline when it's finished in the next 3 years, there's, our fiscal capacity jumps up to $70 billion a year. We get one more pipeline to Tidewater, and, it may well be through Montana, Idaho, and Washington State if BC doesn't want to play ball, if they don't want the jobs and if they don't want the revenue generated, through their ports. That's fine. We can send the oil, to Washington, because we're not going to have Ottawa negotiating our international pipeline crossings anymore. We can do it ourselves without Ottawa's involvement, without the involvement of the National Energy Board, right? Things are going to be so much better and so much easier to do in Alberta. We think within 3 to 5 years, we can double, if not triple, Alberta's oil production. And within 3 to 5 years, Alberta can be a jurisdiction like Dubai, where all of our social services are fully costed and fully paid for, and we have zero income tax in the province of Alberta. So that's the future we want for our children. And then on top of it, supply and demand. Once we locate all of the people here on Trudeau's open work permits and send them back to where they belong, we're saying, sorry, David, we're going to send them directly to Ottawa, and then Ottawa can resettle them from there. But once we free up the Alberta job market, so that kids in Alberta can get summer jobs again and can have entry level employment, Alberta is going to be a wonderful place to live, and we're not going to have this shortage of housing that was created on behalf of Brookfield by Carney and Trudeau, flooding our country with immigrants that are not required to work in Canada, driving up the prices of rents through government subsidies, going to the tune of $88,000 a year, going to all these new Canadians that they're bringing in at unprecedented historical rates. We didn't even allow this many people in per year after World War II. But Alberta's being flooded with people. We don't have the jobs for them. We don't have the housing for them. We don't, we were out of water last summer in Calgary. We don't have the water for them. We don't have the electricity for them. We don't have the hospital beds for them. But the Liberals keep flooding Alberta with, all these people on work permits that we don't need. Well, that's going to stop. Alberta's going to take control of its own immigration. We're going to be deporting everybody here on a work permit that's not working. And we're going to take control of our province as our country and move forward in a much more rational basis, where people living in Alberta are making the decisions about how Albertans want to live their lives.
Well, like I said, I think it's well spelled out in your document. Wanted to ask you before we discuss that document further. In the news this week, of course, there's talk of this counter referendum coming from a former progressive conservative deputy leader in Alberta. And the question being, should Alberta remain as a part of Canada? And of course, I see the theatrics, the ploy here is to steal the thunder and the movement and the momentum of the Alberta Prosperity Project. And I guess a very simple question: do you intend to challenge that referendum, or do you intend to challenge it in terms of telling people to simply vote no, so we can have a subsequent referendum on Alberta independence? Or would a no vote on that referendum constitute a yes vote for Alberta independence?
Well, the first thing, let's back up a little bit here and talk about Thomas Lukasik, right? Thomas Lukasik has been thrown out of the United Conservative Party for life because he endorsed Rachel Notley in the last election. The reason we surmise that Thomas Lukasik is endorsing the NDP is because Thomas Lukasik's new lucrative life mission is to bring Sharia law to Alberta, because he is partners in a company that thinks they have figured out a way to provide quote unquote halal mortgages under Sharia law. So that's what Thomas Lukasik is all about. So he was backing the NDP in the last election because of this, and he got thrown out for life from the United Conservative Party of Alberta. So obviously now Thomas Lukasik feels threatened by Alberta independence and his schemes to bring Sharia law to Alberta. So he started this mischief petition, and that's all it is. It's a mischief petition. We do not believe that Lukasik has the organization or the capacity to get 300,000 signatures in 90 days to have a referendum. In the meantime, his question is not a constitutional question. It's merely a non-binding policy question, which we believe, which we believe isn't going to fly. I don't want to comment on this further because I don't want to, end up practicing law for the other side. But suffice it to say that APP will be going forward under the new legislation requiring us to only get 177,000 signatures. We will be, we've got over 250,000 pledges for signatures now. I'm sure that Lukasik is starting from scratch and doesn't have any signatures pledged to his petition, maybe other than, some union bosses are telling them they're going to help for whatever reason. But keep in mind, I don't think the rank and file union membership is on side with the bosses and the NDP on this one. All the cops and firemen and nurses and, other people that I talk to understand what we're doing and understand the value of what we are doing for them and their families, and certainly understand how much better off their lives are going to be when their taxes are cut, by 30 to 50% in year one, and when they're in a zero income tax environment by year 5. So, I don't think that the rank and file union members are with the union bosses on this one. I think a lot of them remember that the union bosses wouldn't even grieve union claims during COVID when union workers were being fired for not getting or laid off for not getting the shots. And the union members were lockstep with the union bosses were lockstep with the NDP and Theresa Tam on the COVID shots. I don't think that the unions have the credibility that they once had. And certainly, we know, there's lots of teachers that support what we're doing. Certainly every policeman that I've spoken to, is on board with us, et cetera, et cetera. So, we don't think what Thomas Lukasik is doing is going to succeed, and we're moving forward on that basis. I think Thomas Lukasik is a joke, frankly.
Okay, I appreciate the fact you don't want to go on about that. I don't think personally. I don't think he's got the blue or the blue collar support or the grassroots support to come up with that many names. I think this is all charade. So we will see what happens. But there's absolutely no way we're going to see a referendum in either way until 2026 at this point, right? Because there's no way we're going to see a poll referendum.
That's what it's looking like because of the way that Danielle and Elections Canada have stacked the deck against us, for sure. Right? Let's not forget that she could have proclaimed the Citizens Initiative Act a month and a half ago or 2 months ago, and they've been dragging their feet on it. Our only question is we're going to be waiting outside of Elections Alberta's office on Friday to file our petition under the new act. Whether they're going to play the same games with that they played with the Davidson report on COVID and hold it until 2 or 3 in the afternoon, so that it doesn't make the news cycle. It'll be interesting to see what what bullshit games her little communications department is going to play around this on Friday, but I guess we'll find out.
Would you describe Premier Smith's attitude right now as highly conflicted? Because obviously, I don't know where in her heart of hearts she stands on this issue. I know she's a very proud Albertan, and where that takes her, that's up to her conscience. But she realizes a majority of the UCP membership supports independence, and she realizes she has to tread very carefully. As Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, used to say, when you're faced with a very difficult decision, you have to make an agonizing reappraisal. That was one of his buzzwords from his tenure as Secretary of State. And I think that's where Danielle Smith inevitably is going to be, making an agonizing reappraisal in terms of where she is in Alberta, what kind of Alberta she leads, and where she fits into that picture. I think she's always going to be a leader, but I think it's going to be very difficult for her to decide ultimately whether she remains a federalist or embraces the independence cause. So would you say she's struggling right now with that whole ad?
Well, not only struggling, but she's burning up, she's burning up political capital like $100 bills, right? It's like, every time she turns around, I'm on Team Canada, gets her little pom-poms out. And then Quebec says, Team Canada, we will have no pipelines through Quebec. And then she goes, I'm on Team Canada. And then David Eby goes, we don't want any Alberta pipelines through British Columbia. And it's like, I'm on Team Canada. Mark Carney's going to give me a pipeline. And then Stéphane Gibault pops out. There's no need for more pipelines. We will not be giving anyone a new pipeline. So she's playing on a team, where every time she turns around, somebody either elbows her in the mouth or cross-checks her in the face. So, she's looking progressively more and more foolish because it doesn't look like she's going to get anything that she wants. I think when the realization hits that the only pipeline that Carney was going to approve was the CO2 pipeline from the oil sands region to Cold Lake, and that his idea of an energy corridor is, electrical high tension lines running from coast to coast with Brookfield-owned modular nuclear power plant repeating stations along the line to take care of line loss, so that when he mandates Albertans to be forced to only drive electric vehicles, that every time we plug our vehicle into a plug, the money goes directly into Carney's offshore Brookfield bank account. I think that's Carney's plan for the future. And I think Danielle had better wake up to it. The other question I have for Danielle is, the minute she reads this document, The Value of Freedom, right? I spoke at a UCP event last week, and at this UCP event, it was called The Courage to Listen. I was the wrap-up speaker. I was the last speaker there, and I spoke about this document and the numbers in this document. And what I said was that the standard of a fiduciary at Canadian law is the conduct expected of a reasonably prudent person of business managing their own affairs, right? That's the legal standard for a fiduciary, from a case called Frame versus Smith at the Supreme Court of Canada. So that's the standard. So if you read that document and you see the numbers in that document and how well off Albertans are going to be financially when we pursue independence from Canada, I say that it is a breach of fiduciary duty for any elected MLA, any cabinet minister, any premier of Alberta not to pursue independence on the strength of the numbers in that document. So, Danielle's going to have to get her head around it. Does she want to lead an independent Alberta, or does she want to face a massive backlash from members of her own party who are furious that she is standing in the way of Alberta freedom and standing on side with people like of the ilk of Jason Kenney, Mark Carney, Trudeau, and others that want to continue to subjugate, control, and oppress her fellow citizens in Alberta? That's the choice for her. So it's going to be interesting to see what she does with that. I think that, I think she's going to have to start seriously thinking sooner rather than later, as to where we're ending up. I've emailed her a copy of that document yesterday as a courtesy, along with the advice that we're going to be taking the position that any MLA, premier, or cabinet minister that will not support Alberta independence on the strength of the numbers in that document is basically in breach of their fiduciary obligations to the voters of Alberta. And we're going to be proceeding forward on that basis. We're giving her the benefit of the doubt. She said she wanted 6 months. She has 4 months left, right? But, Albertans need to ask themselves, like, if Danielle gets a pipeline, so what, right? Half of the money is going to keep going to Ontario, Quebec, and the rest of Canada. Whereas if we're independent, we get an extra pipeline, 2, 3, or 4. It just makes it that much quicker for every Albertan to live in a completely tax-free jurisdiction without any more federal or provincial income tax. Well, who wouldn't want that?
Well, yes. And I was somewhat dismayed to, I guess, put it mildly, that Premier Smith endorsed Bill C-5, which, and I don't know why she thinks she had to, because the bill was going to pass, even with the approval of the official opposition, which I was also somewhat dismayed over, that there was really no discussion or debate or argument about how toxic this bill potentially is going to be. This is Mark Carney is in control bill. This is corporate cronyism. And this is Mark Carney deciding where the projects are going to be, and probably for the benefit of his private sector interests. So I don't know why either Pierre Poilievre or Danielle Smith approved of this bill, except perhaps to think they were going to get something out of it for Alberta. I don't know, but I wanted to ask you this. Pierre Poilievre is going to have, there's going to be a by-election, of course, in Crowfoot. The last MP won that seat with 80% of the vote. And I looked it up last week because I was discussing this with another colleague. Do you think he's going to be getting questioned at every doorstep about why should Alberta stay in Confederation? Why should Alberta not be independent? Because this is a rural Alberta riding where I'm sure, and well, in fact, I know support for independence is very high. Is this going to be a difficult by-election for Pierre Poilievre?
I sure hope so. Let's be really clear. I even question whether Pierre Poilievre can even call himself an Albertan anymore. I say that he's about as Albertan as Mark Carney. During the federal election, he supported continued equalization payments going from Alberta to Quebec. He supported, he supports the dairy mafia from Montreal and supply management. Those aren't Albertan values. For fun, I've been tweeting out, and I'll probably say it again publicly tonight, that I have a slogan for Pierre that he should run under in Battle River-Crowfoot, and that is no more Alberta money for Quebec and a milk cow and micro dairy in every barn. Come on, Pierre, I dare you, right? He won't do it, and it underlines the problem of Canadian federalism. All of these wannabe federal prime ministers, including Jason Kenney, who we know was getting ready to stab Pierre in the back the minute he can so that, Kenney can then swoop in and be the savior of the Conservative Party of Canada. All of these wannabe federal politicians, hate the idea of Alberta independence because they can't govern the country without us. They can't get elected without us. And more importantly, without Alberta's wealth, they can't continue to bribe all of the parasitic leeches in Quebec who live off of the backs and blood of hardworking Albertans as if it's their God-given right. So that's the problem. So I hope that that Pierre gets nothing but grief at the doors in Battle River-Crowfoot. That the people ask them how the hell it is that that you can support the parasitic relationship between Quebec and Alberta, and why the hell should any true Albertan vote for you? That's what I hope he's hearing at the doors.
Well, wanted to get back to the document here because I think I love this conclusion. And I think this is why I say this is almost irrefutable evidence of why an objective Albertan could be convinced, I'll put it that way, of independence, because it says an independent Alberta could retain an estimated 68 to 75 billion in annual federal tax revenues, with a net gain of 44 to 47 billion after accounting for current federal transfers. This substantial fiscal capacity would enable substantial tax reductions, while transformative investments in infrastructure, public services, and economic diversification, positioning Alberta as a robust, self-sustaining economy. Now, that to me is the crux of this whole document. I want to get into the immigration question in a minute as well. But how does a federalist refute that? Because all they've really got is Do you remember Canada? And I said this, Jeff, on Canada Day. I said, I remember Canada. I remember when it was called Dominion Day. I'm old enough to remember that as a kid. I'm old enough, though, to remember a Canada where you could actually burn leaves in your backyard without the local bylaw officer coming around with a hose telling you can't do that. We can't do anything in this country anymore without the federal government getting its nose involved. And so, to me, if you're appealing to patriotism in Canada, if you're appealing to the Canada that stormed Juno Beach on June 6, 1944, if you're appealing to the Canada that always punched above its weight, but wasn't a woke DEI country that was dedicated to identity politics, maybe you'd have a chance in winning this argument. But I'm talking to people in Ontario who are saying, you know, I couldn't go out and celebrate Canada Day this year because I don't like what's happened to my country. So what I'm saying, Jeff, is you've got the evidence here, the fiscal evidence in front of people. This is a 44-page document that is strong. You've also got, I think, on your side, the fact that the Canada that these federalists are talking about in Alberta doesn't exist anymore. That Canada is gone. So what kind of argument can your opponents come up with when you've got this kind of evidence on your side?
Well, I've been challenging Danielle Smith, to give us 3 good reasons for Albertans to stay in Canada. I sent an open letter to her, and I mean, I just sort of rattled off, the top of my head, our top 10 reasons for wanting to leave Canada. No more federal regulation, right? No more federal income tax. No more carbon tax. No more GST. No more, on and on and on, right? And think about all the ongoing threats from Canada, including the threat to tax everybody's home equity, because all of the Liberals have just, you know what? We can solve the housing crisis by taxing away people's homes. So they're going to be forced to sell their big houses with all these extra rooms and move into smaller, Brookfield built modular homes. So we'll do that by taxing their home equity, force them to appraise their houses every year, and we'll tax them on the increased value of their houses every year, so we can take their houses away and give them to, immigrant families with 10 children. That's Carney's plan, for the future, and then have all of us live in Brookfield modular homes, again, with all of the money leaving Canada for his offshore Brookfield bank accounts, right? That's the future of Canada. The Canada of yesterday that you and I served under while we were in the military is long gone. That Canada you're right, that Canada doesn't exist anymore. But just a quick anecdote, because I was really, really pleased with this, and I was really proud of our APP volunteers the other day. They put a float in the Canada Day parade celebrating Alberta independence and advising people of an APP event in Airdrie tonight that I'll be speaking at. That float got nothing but applause up and down the parade in Airdrie on Canada Day. So, we're now calling it Alberta Day in Alberta, not Canada Day anymore. And we all hope that this will be the last Canada Day that anybody ever celebrates in Alberta, because we're hoping by this time next year, Alberta will be a free and independent Commonwealth of Alberta.
Yeah, and I just put this slide up here because I think this is another example of how you're breaking down the costs of an independent Alberta versus what is existing today. And here you are breaking down national defense, international relations, federal health programs, and you're not just saying we hope we can match this. You're saying we can exceed it, and I think that's what makes this really, I think, a convincing document in terms of why independence seems to be not just desirable, but I would say in some respects almost inevitable if people look at the choice. This is a stark choice, is what I'm saying. This document represents a stark choice for Albertans. And I think if they read this objectively, even Albertans who cling to the idea of the old Canada somehow being resurrected, resuscitated in some way, I think this document is going to give them serious doubt. And I think that's all I can really say in terms of how you've laid this out. It's very effective.
Well, one of the big lies that Canada and all the federalists like Jason Kenney and the rest of them are playing on, and again, everything they do is just like COVID. It's all fear, 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 right? So, okay, who's the most vulnerable in society? Let's make them the most fearful. Oh, let's tell pensioners they're not going to get their pensions anymore. Well, that's just nothing but a despicable lie. I mean, you're still going to get, CPP is a legal obligation. So you're no more going to be cut off of your CPP if you live in Alberta than if you live in Costa Rica and collect your CPP, or Portugal or wherever. It's a lawful obligation. But, we're confident on the basis of the numbers generated in this document that, within 5 years, we could slash Alberta pension contributions in half and double pension payouts to existing pensioners because we can afford it, right? So, that's not something you're going to get if you stay in Canada. If you stay in Canada, you get the status quo, and you literally, every time you turn around, try to figure out how you're going to make ends meet, because Mark Carney, the central banker, advised Trudeau in the last 5 years to double Canada's M2 money supply. So that's literally, they've doubled the supply of money in Canada. So if you wonder why everything feels like it costs twice as much as it did 5 years ago, that's why. Because your Canadian dollar is worth half of what it was 5 years ago. One of our volunteers, incidentally, is a UBC educated economist who used to work for the Bank of Canada. And he's the one that was telling me this. And he says, of course, Mark Carney, as a central banker, was in cahoots with all the other central bankers, with Bank of England, the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve. They all did the same thing during COVID. So it didn't really look like the Canadian dollar had changed that much in relative terms to the US dollar, the euro, or the pound. But it's because all of those central bankers, along with Carney and Trudeau, doubled their money supply during COVID so that they could pay for all their little COVID handouts. So that's why everything's so expensive right now. It's because all the central bankers have been screwing with us and have literally devalued our dollar by 50%. And nobody's talking about that. An independent Alberta is not going to ever, be treated that way. In fact, our next document that we're going to be releasing in a couple of weeks is an interim constitution for an independent Alberta. And I can assure you that the central banks is going to be constitutionalized. There's going to be strict limits on debt and deficit spending, et cetera, et cetera. So, the constitution that we're working on, does what a lot of, even the U.S. Constitution didn't do, which was to put economic guardrails around politicians. Because if we've learned anything, that's that politicians can't be trusted with money, right? So, that's something that we are very much looking forward to, and we're really excited, here, in a couple, 2 to 3, 4 weeks to releasing the draft interim constitution once everybody has fully internalized the value of freedom, set out in the fiscal plan that we've developed for an independent Alberta.
So you've got a points-based system here for immigration. I find it interesting. Canadian citizen, you get 40 points unless you have a criminal record. You've got all of the criteria.
To use Ralph Klein's terms, no more creeps and bums.
He sent them all to BC. Yeah.
Yeah. No, or we'll send them back to Toronto. Either way.
He used to bust them to BC. I remember that. So I was in BC at the time, but. I mean, you've laid this out quite clearly. Are you expecting that there's going to be a lot of interest in people flocking to Alberta if and when the province becomes independent?
Well, what's really interesting is that it's already happening. Jason Kenney and Nancy Southern, because of course they're both, basically pigs at the trough in terms of cost plus contracts and, basically controlling, ATCO having a good chunk of the Alberta power grid and, all that kind of stuff, right? But, people like that are against what we're doing. But I mean, there's just recently been a $1.1 billion hotel project announced for downtown Calgary. I've spoken to all kinds of people that are selling their businesses in Ontario, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Maritimes, and moving to Alberta because they want to be here on the day that Alberta declares its independence from Canada. I mean, I've run into lots of people from Ontario that are either planning on moving in the short term or who have already sold all of their businesses in Ontario and are moving to Alberta, and we're excited and happy to have them. Those are the type of people that we want moving to Alberta. People that are hardworking, industrious, and want to share in our future prosperity, as opposed to people that are just coming looking for a handout.
I love this one here, towards a great economic future. You quoted one of my favorite baseball players. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So yeah, you've got to admit nobody can really predict. Nobody has a crystal ball economically where things are going to go. But you're looking at, as you say at the very beginning of this report, you're not looking at the most optimistic scenario. You're looking at perhaps the most pessimistic scenario in terms of how things might not go as well as some anticipate. But even under those circumstances, you're spelling out here that this is going to be a great economic future.
Well, that's one of the things that we're really proud about this document for, and why we're so excited about this document, is we don't factor in the massive economic growth that we believe is going to happen in Alberta the day that Alberta declares itself independent from Canada. Let's face it, honest businesses that work within the North American capitalist system, right, thrive on low taxes and low regulation. So real businesses thrive under those circumstances. The only businesses that don't thrive under those circumstances, and I'll use it's a good Alberta word, bullshit businesses that thrive in a high tax, high regulatory environment, because they exist largely on government subsidies. So that's, basically every green new scam, to use President Trump's term, business that's, whether it's a battery plant, a bug plant, a hydrogen plant, a solar plant, a windmill plant, any of those businesses only work because the government has its hands deep in the pockets of poor, hardworking taxpayers, taking money out of their pockets to give it to businesses that only work if they're heavily subsidized by government. It's the whole World Economic Forum model, right? I've always said that the WEF is nothing more than an investment club for multi-billionaires that gets together once a year in Davos to figure out how they're going to front-run investments into areas where governments will provide them massive subsidies at the expense of hardworking men and women who pay taxes. That's the model of all of them. And, the great thing is that, we're confident that in an independent Alberta, those businesses will not be welcome. They will not be tolerated. And unless you have a business model that runs on actual economics, which is that you can actually produce things that are valuable to society, not carbon sucking machines, right? Your business will not be welcome in Alberta.
I wanted to leave people with this very graphic depiction of where people could be in 2045, just 20 years from now. So you're saying direct revenue could go from 144.7 billion to 333.8 billion. That's like almost 3 times as much. Cost savings, 36.3 billion by 2045. Total economic activity, 584 billion versus 253.2 billion today. That's over twice. So once again, I say this is a picture that is very hard to refute and very hard to disclaim. I think you've produced a document here that lays out in a very dispassionate way, because you've said at the very end that maybe it's just enough to want to have an independent Alberta. Maybe it's just enough to want to be a little freer from Mark Carney. But look at all of the evidence we've laid out before you. So I think this document speaks for itself. And
just think about what you were just saying though. Like those projections, are doubling, the size of the Alberta economy by 2045. We think we're going to double it, that's very, very, very conservative, right? Like the gross domestic product of Ireland is over $500 billion. Alberta is currently, 355. There's no reason with the population of Alberta and the resources that we have here compared to Ireland, our land base, et cetera, that we shouldn't be at $1 trillion a year in GDP by year 5. But again, this whole document, even the future projections, are extremely, extremely conservative and based on worst case models, not best case models.
Well, Jeff, I'll leave it at that. I know you've got other things to do this morning. This has been a fascinating look at this document. Thanks for finally getting this to me as the final draft. I'm very impressed. I have to say that I read through this, and as you know, I'm very conflicted myself over this whole issue. I have family in Alberta. I grew up in Western Canada and British Columbia. I'm in Ontario only because I have to be close to Ottawa. But perhaps that will no longer be relevant. And as I said, I talked to so many people just before on Canada and before, and they all said, you know, this country, in fact, one friend of mine said, I can't celebrate this year because, you know, this country has become so communist. That's it. It has. Because we've got a guy in charge of this country now who is taking us down an authoritarian route. This is backroom government, co-opting the opposition, running roughshod over our rights, and threatening to take away our free speech again. So I don't know. I don't know who's out there saying, I still love this country. I still love this country. I love what Canada used to be. There's a part of me that hopes we can return to that, but I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic that that's realistic or even something that can ever happen.
But David, I think before we sign off, we need to circle back to Bill C-5 for a minute, right? Because I don't think people really understand the amount of power that's put in Mark Carney's hands. And, you know, you're a student of history, so you'll get where I'm going with this, right? That whole program that's laid out in Bill C-5, where Mark Carney literally has the dictatorial power to exempt his crony corporations from federal law, has the power to grant sole source contracts to his crony corporations. He has the power to pick and choose which projects in the national interest, you know, get constructed, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think the world has seen anything like this since Mussolini was in power. And again, you know, for students of history, right, you know, Mussolini's word for this type of capitalism was fascisti, right? Everybody working together. That was the slogan. In other words, fascism, right? So this isn't hyperbolic. This isn't me just, throwing Molotov cocktails at Mark Carney. The simple fact of the matter is, if you go back and historically look at the industrial programs that were led by Mussolini and were led by Hitler, and again, I'm not saying Carney is Mussolini or Hitler, but he's giving himself the power of Mussolini and Hitler to engage in all of these crony capitalist deals. I mean, look at Klaus Schwab's family wealth. It all came from his father running slave labor factories in Bavaria using Jewish slave labor. You know, so, and again, Hitler would pick and choose which companies got the contracts, which companies, you know, would thrive within the National Socialist world. Well, Carney's basically given himself the same power under Bill C-5. And nobody in Canada, like all the conservatives, oh, that's a good idea. We like fascism. It's a really good idea. You know, Danielle Smith gets our little pom-poms. Yay, fascism, yay, right? It's despicable. Like nobody understands history and nobody has the capacity to remember their grade 8 social studies, or maybe they don't teach that anymore in grade 8 social studies. They certainly taught fascism to us when I was in grade 9 at École Secondaire Champlain in Ottawa. You know, so I mean, that was part of the program, right?
Yeah, well, fascism used to mean an economic theory. It was corporatism. And of course, Mussolini implemented that in Italy and Hitler to some extent in Germany. But, you know, Orwell said in 1946 or 47, he said, fascism has ceased to mean anything except something unpleasant. So people forget it was an economic theory. And I think that's why Mark Carney is so good at adapting it, because people think, well, that doesn't sound so bad. We're all working together, but corporations are going to work with us.
It's good. We're all together.
Anyway, Jeff, thank you so much for joining me today. And I am going to continue to talk about this report because I think it's an excellent document, and continue to talk about the dynamics in Alberta right now.
And again, I think that's one of the other things that we're really happy about with this document is that it makes the point, regardless of how well off everybody in Alberta is going to be at the end of the day. This is the concept that we want people to internalize. namely the value of freedom is priceless. Notwithstanding the fact that we're going to be billions and billions and billions of dollars ahead, just the fact that we're no longer going to be regulated by Ottawa is absolutely priceless. So,
yeah, I think that's an excellent summary. Jeff, thank you for joining me today, and we'll be talking very soon, I'm sure.
all right. Well, thank you, David. I appreciate you having me on.
Bye for now.
Over and out.
I was Jeff Rath, and we'll be back with more. Yes, sorry, had my mic on mute during that interview. Thank you for watching that today. We really enjoyed talking to Jeff, but that's not it. We've got some more, because we were talking about the winking concept, and I have to make this comment here. Thank you for a very vigorous
A lot done.
dialogue.
In fact, UK, we signed a
But I wanted to make this comment. Thank you for a very vigorous dialogue, but please, we're here to criticize and do a critique of policies, politics, not to say nasty things about people's races or religions, because I happen to believe in the equality of everybody before the law. I don't agree with people's politics, but that doesn't mean I want to alienate them. And I certainly would never say anything about somebody's race or religion or ethnicity, because to me, it's what you believe. And I abide by the creed of Martin Luther King Jr., who said, I judge people by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Anyway, can we roll that clip again, please? Oh, here we
lot
go.
done. In fact, UK, we signed a
Yeah, that is literally Mark Carney winking behind Donald Trump's back at Emmanuel Macron. And this is a problem, folks. But why is he winking? Remember when Mark Carney said this when he was first appointed prime minister?
Third thing we're going to do is to ensure that there's fair competition for our companies, and that we penalize high polluting foreign imports. So we're going to develop a carbon border adjustment mechanism. What that does is promote jobs here at home. It prevents carbon leakage abroad, and it aligns Canada with our allies who are still engaged in the fight against climate change.
Yeah, and this illustrates why Mark Carney is out of step now. Apparently, even with Europe, because Mark Carney is always saying he wants Canada to be more like Europe, right? So the EU Parliament backs exempting 90% of companies from carbon border levy. And that's what Mark Carney is referring to. So what does it really mean, though? That's it. It said, however, the scheme would not lose its impact, as the remaining 10% of importers are responsible for more than 99% of the emissions associated with imports covered by the carbon border tariff. The Commission proposed these changes in February to replace the existing rules under which all individuals or companies importing CBAM covered goods with a value above €150, $170 Canadian, would have had to pay the levy from next year. Companies will have to buy permits to cover the carbon emissions of importing products, including steel, cement, aluminum, and fertilizers, starting from the year 2026. So Now, it's interesting because Europe shares something with Canada. German corporate insolvencies at highest level in a decade, study shows. Corporate bankruptcies in Germany were at their highest level in a decade in the first half of 2025, as firms in Europe's largest economy struggled with weak demand, rising costs, and uncertainty. A study by economic tracking agency Credit Forum showed on Thursday. Now, why do you think that is? Probably because of the green scam, the green energy scam. But you know what? That's nothing compared to what's happening in Canada. Business insolvencies for the 12-month period ending January 31st, 2025, increased by 11.7% compared with the 12-month period ending January 31st, 2024. Increased by almost 12%. Construction, transportation, and warehousing, and administrative and support, waste management, and remediation service registered the biggest increases in the number of insolvencies. So that's where Canada is. Canada's in worse shape than Europe, and Mark Carney wants to make us more like Europe. And yet, Europe seems to be budging a bit on this carbon levy, this carbon tariff that Mark Carney has ludicrously suggested is going to bring more jobs into Canada. It's going to be a job buster. It's going to be a job destroyer. And so why is he even considering this? Because he is completely captive to a political ideology, and he doesn't care if he has to impoverish you in the process. I'm going to quickly show my story here, and we'll be right back with a concluding remark. Yep, I'm in nobody's pocket. Never will be. I have been in the past, but not again. Mark Carney has nothing to wink about. Even the National Post has noticed his winking problem, but I have to say it's been the viewers of Stand on Guard who noticed this was becoming an epidemic. And it started on the day he was first sworn in as Prime Minister. He winked at the camera. Private joke or a public fool? You decide. That's all the time we have today. Thank you for watching today, and God bless this country. I still say that with earnestness and sincerity. Godspeed to all of you. And this has been David Krayden, broadcasting live from Ottawa for another episode of Stand on Guard. Join me again tomorrow when we'll be back.